I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Maurice Carlos Ruffin, I have been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. I've been reading you since the first book. And We Cast a Shadow is a little different from the new novel, but you can kind of see how they're connected. The American Daughters is out now. It's a historical, but you do some cool stuff with context that we're kind of going to talk about, but kind of not, because as you know, we don't like to do spoilers on this show. Anyway, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Miwa, I love your show so much. Thank you for having me here today.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so The American Daughters, though, you were in Oxford, Mississippi, and I'm pretty sure this book came out of being a little homesick for New Orleans, yeah?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, The
Okay.
American Daughters, I'm writing that book in John Grisham's mansion in Oxford,
Oh,
Mississippi.
okay.
And it's during the pandemic, so I'm by
Okay.
myself and I'm thinking a lot about my hometown, New Orleans, and my ancestors. And the sort of difference between being by yourself and being with community. And the
Yeah.
book kind of came out of that.
So I love the women in this novel. I really, really love the women. This is the sort of the days leading up to the start of the Civil War and early in the Civil War in New Orleans. And obviously, there are some plot points that folks will recognize given the setting and given the time period.
Mhm.
But there are also, you do some fun things by adding a little spin on context. You take us quite far into the future. And
Mhm.
obviously, we're not going to talk about what you say specifically, but I want to talk about this idea of balancing historical fiction and, well, dystopian, because that first novel of yours was not quite, I mean, yes, it's satire, but you also play with time and
Yeah.
space and some other things. So is this kind of what, is this the space you want to be in? Are you going to choose?
Well, the thing about it is that I think that all writing is writing,
Yeah,
and
okay.
always looking at my favorite authors and my favorite books, and I'm thinking about what if I did something like that. So, without spoiling the ending to The American Daughters, I was thinking very much about Margaret Atwood and Handmaid's
Okay.
Tale, and how that book ends. And so, if you know Margaret Atwood and you love that book, you'll get there and go, "Oh, this is really cool." So, I do those kinds of things because I really enjoy those kinds of things when I read them.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I appreciate. And you do this in the stories too, that you're always moving forward. The story never stops. And freedom, obviously, is a big piece of The American Daughters and what freedom means for all kinds of characters, not just Addie and not just her mom, and not just this other gal, Lenore, who we meet later on. But freedom is the thing that is trickiest. And freedom also is not necessarily a word that your characters have. Can we talk about that for a second? Because that seems like the heart of the thing for me, at least.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's this phrase that comedians use. It's called
Mm-hmm.
commit to the bit. And it's
Okay.
the idea of like, what does it feel like to be in somebody's shoes? So for the people in this book, it's an unusual cast of characters in that, the mother Sanit and the main character Adi and some of those people are enslaved. And yet a lot of the characters are free. You have black women in New Orleans who are free, like Lenore, for example, in Alabama. And that's what my city was like. New Orleans is unusual in that during slavery times, you had about half free people who were black and half enslaved. And so this idea of freedom is kind of unknown to the main character because she's never really
Right.
seen it with her own eyes. And then she gets to the city and sees, oh, what do you even call that thing? So it's never spelled out, but she experiences it.
And she knows she wants it, obviously, and
Yes.
that's where a big piece of the story comes together. There's one character that I was mentioning to you before we started taping, where I was like, no, I just really wanted to punch him in the throat, and that's yes, I I knew you would understand who I was talking about. But that's one of the things I get from reading your work, whether it's the stories, whether it's the debut, whether it's this book, even though they're all sort of very different in feel, the soul of the thing is the same,
Hmm.
right? Like, obviously, you're doing different things stylistically, and the stories are present day, and it's all big, beating heart kind of stuff. There are a couple of stories, especially the titular story, which is ultimately about gentrification in New Orleans, which is happening at a lightning pace.
Hmm. Hmm.
So to take all three of your books and sort of sit them on a continuum, right? Like you've got the satire slash dystopian slash where exactly are we and exactly what year is this? And then we've got the stories that are clearly present day New Orleans. And now you've taken us back in time, and I feel like you've been sitting with all of this for a really long time.
The idea of going to the past was almost an accident because while I do love
Mm-hmm.
historical fiction and
Right.
I love watching movies that are set in the past, I never thought that I would do it myself.
Okay.
And then I looked at my own catalog and I realized I had written 3 or 4 short stories set in the distant past. One of those is in the collection. Another one is in the 400 Souls book that came out a few years ago. It's a collection of African American essays and stories. And so I was like, Maurice, you're already doing it. Just go ahead and do it. And you're totally right that I think the soul is meant to be the same in all of the books, even though the
Right.
style and the time periods are different. And to me, it's New Orleans. It's how I see my city.
Okay, so let's talk about New Orleans for a second because honestly, I have not been. It is on my list of places I should go. I just, it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, yeah, I should go, and then suddenly it's Tuesday and you're in Los Angeles. But talk to me about your New Orleans, and can we run sort of the gamut from, the setting of The American Daughters through to New Orleans now as we're taping at the end of January in 2024?
Well, I am very fortunate to be a New Orleans person. It is one of the most unique cities in the world, definitely in America. I encourage anybody to come visit at least once, whether it's for something obvious like Mardi Gras or just to kind of hang out in the sort of quieter times. Even though there are no quiet times, New Orleans is the kind of place where you're always going to see weird stuff and talk to interesting people, but people are friendly. It's a city that when it was founded in 1718, it had these influences from the French, obviously, but also there was a very strong Native American community all around the city in the sort of rural areas. And as you go forward through time, we have these, how to say this? I think whatever's happened in America has happened in New Orleans times two. So you have the immigrant population that is coming from Europe in the sort of 17, 1800s, and then you have the sort of outflow of people who are of European descent in the 1950s to 1970s. So that by the time I'm like in my teenage years in the 90s, it's like 80% African American. And so I grew up in that. And what that meant for me personally is that while my city had slavery, back in the 1700s, 1800s, by the time I'm like, 15 years old, I can't imagine what racism is. I'm not seeing it because my school is black, my church is black, my community is black. And then gentrification starts happening post Katrina after 2005. And you get outsiders who are coming in saying, we want to change everything. We don't want to have music being played at nighttime, on the porch and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I've had to ask a lot of questions, like what is my city and how do I fit into it? How do
Right.
any of us fit into my city now?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in parts of New York too, where people are sort of moving out into, say, Washington Heights and whatnot, and they're like, "But it's noisy." And it's like, "Yeah, it was noisy before you moved."
Yes,
And noise is like a gentrification. Like,
yes,
you live in New York. I mean,
yes.
same thing. Like LA, I sort of feel very much the same way. I'm like, the city was here before you, and this place. But New Orleans really, because you're writing about freedom and because Audie and her mom are who they are, I don't think you could set this book somewhere else. I mean, I'm thinking sort of specifically of a piece that happens in Yeah Jesse's first book, Homegoing, where a black woman is kidnapped off the street.
Mm, I love that book.
But I do too, but by slave catcher, but it's Philadelphia, and it's just the tension is here. Please don't misunderstand me. I mean, there's plenty of danger and fraught choices that people have to make. But at the same time, Audie can move around in this
Mhm.
community, even though there's the creepy guy that I would like to punch in the throat. She can move around in the community in a way that would not be possible somewhere else. And I think if we didn't have that, we would be missing a piece of her
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
without her
absolutely.
knowing it.
No, and the thing about it, I made a very conscious choice to set it within the city. I mean, my dad's family's from the country. I have some other relatives who are in the country, that sort of thing. And of course, many books that are quote unquote about slavery are often set on plantations. I was very much looking at books like Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophets, which I just
Which is a
adore.
fabulous novel.
I mean, my
Fabulous
goodness,
book.
he was at such a high level in that book, and it was
Mm-hmm.
inspiration for me. There's also a book by Philip Williams coming out called Ours, which comes,
Hours. Oh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh, 573 pages of brilliance. No,
Yeah,
no,
look,
oh, that
one
book
of
is
our
so
finest
good.
writers. I'm not even actually read the entire manuscript. I've heard him read excerpts at Randolph College. My point was, I was like, okay, so they're doing it in this sort of rural areas. But what does it feel like to have a character who is essentially in an open air prison in a country that says it's a free country? And that was a big question for me in this book.
And I think the mother-daughter framework too
Hmm.
is a little different for you. I mean, obviously we had our unnamed narrator and We Cast a Shadow and his son Nigel.
Yes.
And they really, I mean, yeah, Penny is there, mom, Penny is there, but it really is father and son.
Mm.
And now
Mm.
we've kind of flipped it because
Mm.
essentially this is Adi's story and it is her mom's story, and Adi is her mother's daughter, which was quite excellent to discover. But can we talk about parental relationships for a second? Because
Mm.
it is a classic story, right? Like, guy walks into a bar, woman dies. Like,
Yeah.
there are really kind of only so many stories, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's really rich terrain. But how does it shift when you're going from father son to mother daughter?
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, but you're right. My two novels are basically parental relationships with their kids. Um, and I think for me with We Cast a Shadow, my first book, it was probably easier because I've been in that relationship as a
Right,
son, who
right.
had a father. And with this, I was thinking much more about just all the ladies in my life, my mother, my grandmother, my wife, other people, and how they
Hmm.
interact, and wanting to respect that and not do that sort of guy thing of like, I didn't want to seem false or artificial. I wanted to make it feel as authentic as possible.
Yeah.
What it really came down to was that I often find that my women friends and their mothers have these sort of contentious relationships but are so loving and so bound up. And I'm kind of like, what's going on here? Like, you were just like fighting 2 seconds ago, but now you're like, hugging each other. And so, like, to have that play out for me was like this exercise in, all right, take it slow and really, really be observant and follow the emotional beats as the story goes on to
Hmm.
make it feel authentic and realistic.
Part of the fun of the American Daughters, and I say this, I'm a huge fan of Lauren Wilkinson's novel American Spy,
Mm.
which, listeners, if you haven't read that, it is a fabulous take on a John le Carre kind of spy story. Only it may or may not open with, you know what Duplo blocks are? Duplo blocks are.
Yes.
They're bigger Legos. No, she's great. But the idea of reframing a spy story, which is essentially what you do here, and how these women can move, because men would not have been able to do what these women do, and you actually need this framework in order to make the narrative work.
That's exactly it. And Lauren is a fantastic writer. She actually blurbed the book, so
Yes,
that'll
she
be on
did.
the cover of it. And you're totally right. I mean, look, no spoilers, but there's one male character who pops up a little
Hmm.
bit later in the
Yeah,
story.
yeah, that
It's
guy.
like, I got my guns. I'm like, nah, man, you can't. It's not going to work in this context. Where the ladies are more about communication and observation and passing along notes and those sorts of things. And so, to me, it's very interesting. Look, as a cisgender male, I have to recognize the way I see the world is not the way that
Right.
everybody sees the world. Half the world sees the world differently than I do, more or less. And it was fun to dig into that with a spoon, so to speak.
And women obviously are invisible in this community in a
Mhm.
way that, you could argue that women are invisible in lots of communities now. I
Yes,
mean, that through line
yes,
is pretty firm.
yes.
And I mean, yeah, you're from New Orleans, born and bred, but you still had to do a little bit of work to figure out sort of the map of that time. I mean,
Mhm.
200 years ago, essentially, well, 150,
Yeah.
a really, really long time ago. So
Mhm.
you're digging around and you've got to figure out how people are moving, not just women. Like, you've got to figure out layers of class.
Yes.
You've got to figure out layers of race. You've got to figure out lots of stuff that isn't always comfortable to think
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun to do that because I remember a friend let me use their condo in the French Quarter for a period of a couple
Oh,
years, actually.
okay.
And I found it very interesting that a lot of those buildings are still there today. I mean, they were there in like the 1800s, if not even earlier in a couple of cases. And unlike say New York, where like the New Amsterdam buildings are just not there anymore. They were
Right,
wiped
right, right.
away, over a century ago. And so it really gave me a very strong presence of what it must have felt like to walk down a cobblestone street in the year 1850. Because it's
Hmm.
right there in front of my face. It's still there to this day. This idea of like movement and the women in particular, on the one hand, they're not being observed as closely as some of the guys because they're women. On the other hand, they're
Hmm.
being policed in ways that only women are policed,
Right.
which I found very interesting to work with.
And it doesn't necessarily seem to have evaporated all that
Not at
much.
all.
And that's
Not at
one of
all.
the things when I look at the body of work together, right? When I look at the story collection, when I look at the two novels, you have found that through line.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you found a way to keep coming back to this idea that we haven't actually changed all that much. We've renamed things, right? And
Absolutely.
naming, the conventions of naming are really important in the American Daughters. And the example I'm going to use right now is Audie. You know,
Yeah.
she's given a sort of very French name, Antoinette, by someone that she does not want this name from and
Right.
doesn't want to answer to it. And her mother's like, don't answer to it because you're going to forget who you are and forget all of this. And you're Audie, this is who you are. Naming matters, right? Like names are sort of the first thing that get taken away.
Yes.
Like you're walking through Ellis Island, right? And your name gets taken away.
Yes.
Or you are enrolled in a school where a teacher can't say your name and your name gets taken away. And it's just like, wow. And
Right.
that to me is a universal kind of thing, right? Where you're just like, wait, you want to take my name away? What just happened here? And it happens with places, it happens with communities, it happens with neighborhoods, it happens everywhere. It's kind of inescapable.
Miwa, this is why you're so good at your job because you're pulling out threads that I didn't even know that I did in my own books. But you're absolutely right. So in We Cast the Shadow, there's a young girl named Araminta. So I have a thing for these sort of freedom fighters who name start with an A or whatever. You know, she's somebody who is invisible because she's a young person, because she's a girl. And definitely that's happening with Adi. And this idea of sort of naming yourself, like claiming yourself, is really
Yeah.
important to me. There's a character in the American Daughters named Alabama. You know, she gives herself that
I
name.
love her.
You
I
know,
love her.
and that's part
She's
of her
great.
power. You know,
Yep.
saying that I'm going to choose my own name gives her confidence and strength to move through society.
Which she absolutely needs. And again, these women, there's so much action that takes place, but it is not necessarily what you expect, and it works. So I want to talk about pacing for a second too, because again, we're dancing around spoilers. Yes, I totally admit this. We're dancing around spoilers. But you have talked about film being a really big influence for you, and you have better taste in movies than I do. I will totally own that. I will super own that. Because honestly, if I'm at a point where I'm watching something on the screen, like my brain is, I need things to blow up and catch fire. It's tacky and it's true. But you do pull from French cinema, you pull from Japanese cinema, you pull from sort of really exquisite classics that I can sort of feel rolling through your writing. And can we talk about those influences as well?
Oh, sure. Look, I love film so much. And just briefly, so my dad passed 10 years ago in 2014.
Okay.
And he was the kind of person I know he would have said, look, son, give yourself a gift this year. I know you miss me and everything, but do something good for yourself. And so that year I decided to start watching cinema that I'd never seen. I had always loved movies, but I'd never seen a lot of foreign films and a lot of black and white films. And that just changed my life. I mean, my writing was so influenced by watching these films. And what I realized is that as an artist, your job is to consume as much as possible and process it. So the American Daughters, for example, like I don't always agree with the politics of the creators of the films, but I love to learn about the techniques of it. So the American Daughters has a lot to take from, say, the Tarantino films, where it's these sort of revenge epics. You know, Kill Bill is about a lady getting revenge on the guy that messed her over.
Right, right.
Glorious Bastards is about some Jewish people getting revenge on Nazis. Django Unchained is about, you know, this enslaved African American guy getting revenge on the slave masters. And I'm like, well, what if I had something like that in New Orleans? How would that actually play out? So back to the idea of committing to the bit. I have this young black girl and her mother who go to the city very early on, and how is that going to play out throughout the quote unquote film? And also this idea of like, what does genre expect? You know, I could have had, you know, swords and pistols in like the very first page. I grew up reading like comics, for example.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, but this is literature. I need to have like some thoughts to like lead us into who this character is first, you know?
Well, why can't we have both, right? Like you've talked about this before. Like, why can't I have both? Why can't I have entertainment and sort of this deep emotional connection to the characters, to their challenges, to their future? I mean, this is why I read. Like,
Yes.
I'm one of those people where I'm okay if less stuff happens.
Yes.
But then, I get something like The American Daughters or American Spy,
Yes.
or, you share a publisher with Victor Laval and Lone
Yes.
Women.
Oh my goodness. He's a big influence also.
Right. But also talking about like endings that pay off,
Yeah.
right? Like you both very recently have delivered endings that pay off. And I'm really trying to not step on it. But I love this idea that we can have all of the things, right?
Yes.
Like if story is the thing that holds you, and then maybe you end up being surprised by something someone says or does or reveals themselves to be, that's really satisfying to me. Like
Oh yeah.
I kind of need to have my brain broken open And even though I understand the basic structure of the American Daughters, right? I understand the time period. I understand who these women are. I understand who the very bad dudes are. At the same time, there's so much room to be surprised. And so I have to ask, though, are you the guy writing from the outline, or are you the guy making it up as you go along and being surprised along with the rest of us? Because there's a lot, and this is a really tight book. This is what, not even 300 pages or a hair over 300 pages? It's not. It's very tightly written, and I am wondering how much of the writing is rewriting for you.
I really appreciate that observation. I'm the kind of person where I like to get through a good first draft without even thinking about anything really, like no outlines at all. And then I'll go back and I'll kind of think, all right, what is this pot of soup or this gumbo? What is it missing? Does it need salt, pepper, crabs, anything like that, shrimps, that kind of thing. And so I go back in, I think, well, what would make the book more fun for me to write it, honestly. Like even the idea of, it's on the back of the cover, this idea of the sort of spy ring was a sort of later idea. I'm like, well, what if like, no, you can't do that, Maurice. Well, yes, you can do that sort of thing. And
Yeah, and you pulled it off. I mean, that's the thing that I really appreciated, because I was kind of like, okay. I mean, I trust you. I've read the other books. Like, I know what you can do. And I will say, historical fiction is not necessarily a thing I gravitate towards. If it's a writer that I'm curious to see what they do, or I need an idea, I'm not just someone who automatically says, oh, it's historical fiction, I really want to read that. There
right.
are some people who are like that, and that's great, and it works for them. But I need sort of beautiful sentences, and like I'm one of those and people where I'm like, well, can I have beautiful sentences? I don't care if I like the characters or not, but I need ideas driving what I'm reading. And
I'm
I
the same
get
way.
that with you. Yeah, I get that with
I'm the
you too.
same way. And to that point of like surprises, I think that I try to incorporate surprise as part of my practice. The idea of what's fun to me is what is surprising to me. And fortunately, like I've had these wonderful cover artists for my books. And so my books are always like a little warning, like there's gonna be something you think you know what it's about, but something weird is gonna happen at some point. Like even like here's the cover for for American Daughters, and there's so much embedded, you know, text here on the cover that you should think about and you understand it as you get through the book. So
And it totally works. It all, I promise you, anyone who's finished this book and then looks at the jacket, they will absolutely understand all of the elements. But I know you were talking about The Handmaid's Tale being an influence on this book, and structurally, I see that, and it's just in terms of story, I see that. But I mean, you've pulled from Nabokov, certainly with We Cast a Shadow, and sort of the playfulness of the language, right? And Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, and Ellison doesn't really get a lot of credit for being funny.
hmm hmm
And I was dipping back into the opening of that book the other day, prepping for this, and he's like, he's Paul Beatty funny.
yeah,
And I think there are a lot of people who are like, but the book was written in 1950, whatever, and it's like
yeah.
my grandpa's book, and I'm bored. And I'm like, no, 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 no,
No,
no,
no,
no,
no,
no.
no, no.
Like, it had been a minute since
Yes.
I'd read this, but I feel like both of those men are sitting with this book as well. I mean, they're just part of who you are as a writer, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. We Cast a Shadow would not exist without the influence of Lolita
Mm-hmm.
and Invisible Man by Ellison. I was paying homage to those books because they were so formative to me as a writer.
Right.
And this idea of the dry wit, like, Nabokov is somebody who is known for his language and his poetry, which I like to do in my own work. But it wasn't until I heard him read things like on these old YouTube videos. I'm like, that guy is
Oh,
really
yeah.
funny when he reads out loud. And Ellison's wit is so dry, you can't even see it unless you're looking for it.
And I love Ellison so much. I wish there was more where actually his letters are pretty great as well. There's a collection of his letters that it not meant to be read straight through, but dipping in and out of. And certainly Baldwin, right? We have to
Mhm,
talk about James Baldwin for a second,
mhm,
because you sort of see yourself in that kind of vein as an activist writer. And
mhm.
there are some people who, when they hear phrases like activist, start to say, oh no, you're just going to feed me my cultural vegetables. But I think there's an important point to make with Baldwin, because also if you think about how long his work has sort of stuck with all of us, Baldwin and his influence on you and how you sort of carry that around, because I think it matters, because also that guy was writing cut glass sentences. I mean,
Oh, cut glass. I mean, I feel like Baldwin is like Morrison for me, where I admire him so much, but I don't feel like I can sort of do what they're doing because it's the thought processes to me are so complicated. Also, Morrison is somebody else who her humor is so understated. Again, you
yeah,
don't
yeah,
even know
yeah.
he's making a joke until like 10 pages later. But with Baldwin, it's like he was so far ahead of his time in analyzing what was happening in the country. And I think he's had a resurgence because people have embraced rage to some extent, like saying, look at what's happening in the world, how bad it is, and we should be addressing these things. And I'm somebody who studied history, so I go back to even like the Greeks and the Romans, of people like, I don't know, Marcus Aurelius or like Ovid, and I'm saying, look how messed up things are happening. We can do better than this, people.
Yes, so that brings me back again to the three, looking at the three books together, right? Like you've got this satire slash dystopian set in a recognizable near future, let's call it.
Mhm.
You've got the story collection where, okay, with the exception of a couple of stories, it really is present day
Yes.
New Orleans. And now you've gone back to Civil War
Mhm.
New Orleans. And for you, though, let's take out the you consider your writing just across the board, you're a writer, this is what you do. But I think it's really interesting that you chose sort of three different time periods
Mhm.
for each project. And I'm wondering if that frees you up in a different way to be able to look at sort of your main concerns, right? Like here you are talking about the influence that Baldwin's got on you and how you see the world. And yet you kind of need to move around for you as the
Mm.
writer. Like
Mm.
you can't just sit in one place.
Well, I think a part of that for me, and that's a great question. Nobody's ever asked it of me, is that New Orleans to some extent is an understudied territory. I mean, look, New York has thousands of wonderful writers, and many of whom could name them without even trying too hard. New Orleans has a pretty good traditional literature also, but think about like African American writers from my hometown. There aren't that many of us, and so I think about August Wilson and
Yeah,
his,
yeah. Pittsburgh.
um, yeah. So his project of like I'm just going to get these different time periods and try to take a core sample from that time period and make a story out of it. I'm thinking in the exact same way because I've not seen many books of people that look like me from my city from the 1850s or even looking back to the 1850s, and it makes my job a lot easier because I can kind of go, okay, I think I know what like who the characters are, but I have no idea how this is going to play out in that time period, and that's the work which creates the energy, which just produces the actual text.
So you're basically writing a biography of New Orleans, is what I'm
Absolutely,
hearing.
hundred
Okay.
percent. I'm also inspired by, for example, Jeffrey Eugenides with Middlesex.
Yeah. Oh,
Like
I see
reading that
that.
book and the idea of like he takes this one book that covers like the 19 teens, 1920s to
Hmm.
like, the 1980s or 90s. And it's really the story of the city more than it's the story of the family, even the main character. I love that idea, especially for, again, an underserved city like New Orleans, where there's so much story to be told.
Right. And I feel like Katrina put New Orleans on the map for people in a really traumatic way. And that there were other people who I think didn't quite understand the extent of the damage. I've gone back and watched some of the documentaries that have come out of it, and it's shocking
Yeah,
even now to look at these things, 20 years later, almost 20 years later, and
yeah,
just realize that this is America. And then it
absolutely.
happens like 5 minutes later with Harvey in Houston, and you're just like, can we figure out the infrastructure problem? Because we have a problem, and
Yeah.
I'm not an engineer. I don't know how to fix this.
Yeah, and look, for my New York friends, I often will say about Hurricane Katrina and the damage. So New Orleans was, as the kids say, 80% flooded, no cap. So it was 80% flooded. Imagine New York, where everything above Chelsea is flooded, and what that would look like for your town. And people can't hold that in their heads. And frankly, I don't think we have done a good job as a society of really saying what that means to have an American city just destroyed, essentially.
Right, right. Well, and especially a huge piece of the community.
Yes.
I mean, because it really did disproportionately hit African American and Black communities
Yeah.
in New Orleans, Creole
Well,
communities.
there's one stat that I mean, I had to research this stat over and over again to make sure I wasn't like misreading it. We lost 100,000 Black people, and the point is, it's not a big city. Like New York, New
Right.
York is like what 8 million, 9 million people.
Yeah, something
New
like that.
Orleans, maybe 500. On a good day, we lost a
Right.
hundred thousand Black people. That's unheard of. It's just
Right.
unheard of.
You lost a fifth of your community
Yeah.
overall, but in terms of statistically, it was a really significant chunk
Yes.
of the Black population, correct? Okay. That that is just wild to me. And yeah, I've been around hurricanes and whatnot, but that was just unimaginable, I think, for so many of us. And then, to keep this sort of happening. And I'm curious to know what you might be working on next. I feel like you can't write about New Orleans without having climate in our climate emergency sort of in the back of your brain because you've seen what can happen and where it leads with gentrification.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, I'm doing a few things. Let's see, I'll go short and long. So I've written a short story for an anthology, and this is weird. It's an anthology of essays about climate change and how it affects New Orleans. But I was tasked to be the one person to write a short story. So the short story is set in the future, in which we see how climate change could play out, say, 100 years from now. And it was an experience writing that to see like if the city is flooded and then people sort of evacuate, but like a certain kind of person stays around, what does that actually mean? That'll come out like in a year from this anthology. Mary
Okay.
Heglar is putting it together. But I'm writing a book also, and I can't give too many details because we're going to announce it
No,
pretty
no, no.
soon.
I do not. No, no, no. We do
But
not want to get all of the details.
but
High level.
but basically, what I can tell you is that it's about the sort of pre-civil rights generation in New Orleans, say the 19 teens to the 1950s
Yeah,
ish,
yeah.
and how they're dealing with things like the environment and police action in the community and abortion and sort of boycotts and sit-ins and these things sort of all collating together in this sort of World
Right.
War II era, if you will.
So it looks like you're just going to hang out a little bit. I mean, that is one of the things about historical fiction, right? It turns a mirror on where we are, right? And if it's
Yes.
done well, you see like all of the sinew that connects all of these stories, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
the time is kind of immaterial in a way.
All great genres are just showing our actual. I mean, that's why Star Trek, the old, it's just showing America in like this diversity, but also the problems of having this patriotic attitude towards the country.
So basically, you just want to be able to tell stories about New Orleans and its transitions. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me, that
Yeah,
you have your place. I mean, when I think of New Orleans writers too, I think of Ernest J. Gaines,
right.
right? And I think of Britt Bennett's novel, The Vanishing
Mhm.
Half, which I mean, granted, part of it takes place in Los Angeles, but again, it's born out of New Orleans. I feel like you
Mhm.
can't have that book with the trajectory it has without the New Orleans piece.
I feel
And
very
it,
lucky to have been born in New Orleans because there's just
yeah.
so many stories to tell.
But you were a lawyer first. Like it took
Yeah.
you a minute before you decided to do this. And you don't miss being a lawyer, right? Like this
Not
is your
really.
thing.
I
Okay.
mean, I'm still official. I still have like my license, right? But I think for me, the 16 plus years I spent being a lawyer in New Orleans was a training period because it was almost like being a detective. The idea of the detective in a book where you get to see different levels of society, like you're on the streets with, like the thugs, and you're like in the mansions with the rich people. And I saw all of that. And I think if I had just been a writer or just been a lawyer or whatever, I couldn't have brought it all together in my work. And I have this sort of panopticon view of my city, and it's my material. I mean, I'll
Right.
just say I wanted to leave New Orleans as a young person and like go to LA or go to New York, and I was
Right.
so frustrated by not leaving town. And now I'm like, oh, thank goodness I didn't leave town because I've seen it
Right.
all.
Yeah, I it is it is its own planet in a way. I mean, beyond sort of what I know about the food and the landscape, I mean, I don't think I'm built for the bayou. I just don't think I don't think I should be around crocodile. Is it alligators or crocodiles?
Alligators.
Okay, sorry. I sort of feel like I should. And I'm happy on the open ocean. Please don't misunderstand me. Like I can handle myself on a sailboat, but alligators and swampy stuff. I don't know if
All I can
I'm
say is that when you do decide to visit, just don't visit between maybe late May and mid September. Come in like October. That's a great time. The weather's just
okay.
perfect, and we're Halloween year round. People are in costume year round in New Orleans, so
I'm not
it
sure
like
I'm
goes up two
prepared for that.
levels during
Yeah,
October.
yeah.
So it's just a fun time to be in the city.
It's having survived the humidity on the East Coast my entire life, I'm kind
Yeah.
of like, oh, I'm not sure I can do that on vacation as well. But this idea of story, right? And being able to firm up a place
Yeah.
in your mind, and Addie and Sanit really feel like her mom, Sanit, and Lenore. I just keep coming back to this idea that I don't think they could have existed outside
Hmm.
of New Orleans. Like I don't see them being able to move with sort of impunity in a way
Hmm.
in New York or Boston or, Washington D.C., which is its own weird place. But the idea that this can happen at all.
Yeah, I think it's a new idea for the world consciousness because even
Okay.
in like Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave, like he's a free man in a free city who was brought down to the South and enslaved. And he's so surprised because now he's this enslaved person. But again, I mean, just imagine that you're an enslaved person in a city where the majority of people are free people, which is a lot like what maybe ancient Rome was like, for example, you know?
Right, right,
And I just think that for me, there's a lot of story there, and there was a chance to really explore these relationships between her and her mother and her best friend and their community there in the city. And I had this soft spot for people looking at her. I could see like Lenore, who's like her best friend, looking at her and kind of going, "All right, you know, she's enslaved, but how can I help her feel like she's not alone in this experience?"
right.
So even though Lenore is free herself.
Yeah, but then Lenore's dad is trying to send her off to marry that dude who just is. I'm sure he's a very nice man. I'm
I'm sure he's
sure he
very
means well.
nice.
But oh my God, can you imagine dinner conversation with that dude? We would all die of boredom.
Yeah, he should probably get punched in the throat also, to be
Yeah,
honest.
well, I felt less strongly about him than I did. Like, I was just kind of like, I get this. Like, Lenore's dad is trying to do the right thing by his kid, but wow, does he not know his kid?
Yes.
And I didn't feel like the doctor, I mean, I just thought the doctor was kind of a pill more than anything. Like, just a bore. Like, oh, right, this
Mission
is where we,
accomplished. That
right,
was
this,
the
yeah, no, no,
purpose.
no. I mean, this is where we clap, like, he pontificates, and this is where we clap politely. And then it's just like, oh,
Yes.
dude. Is there anything you really wanted to hit with the American Daughters that we haven't done because we're dancing around spoilers like crazy people? In the best possible way, but
Well, I mean, I don't see this as a spoiler because it happens pretty soon. Maybe only about 20 pages in, we get the first insert. And it's a slave bill. It's this idea you're in New Orleans, it's 1844, and you see this document on a post somewhere, and it says, "Hey, you want to buy a slave? Here's like 5 options for you. This is how much they cost. This is their gender. This is their age." And I just really like the idea of having a sort of a meta consciousness in the work that I make.
there's also a piece with the WPA where we get a profile of someone who we sort of lose track of early on, let's put it that way,
Yes.
because I mean, there's nothing like breaking up a family in the name of capitalism, but
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah.
But would you explain the WPA project? Because not everyone knows about it the way maybe we did a few years ago. And I think this is really important. And I'm dancing around the character's name.
Sure,
That
sure,
part
sure.
alone.
Sure. So, WPA came out of the Depression, and the government decided it was very bad to have people on the streets with no opportunities to make any
Right.
money. And
Mm-hmm.
so, one of the things that FDR and the gang put together, Congress, was let's make a program for writers to get paid to, rove the country and collect stories, collect ethnographies, histories, that kind of thing. And so there was a real guy named Milton Cole who was doing this down in the South around that time. And by the way, also Zora Hurston, who's not in the book at all, but she was doing it in Florida. And so I just found it very interesting that you had these people getting these amazing stories. Like you could be somebody like Milton Cole and say, I don't know, 1930, and meet a man who had been enslaved as a child. And you could say, what was it like being a slave as a child? And he would say, well, this is what it was like, Milton. And he was just explaining in his own sort of colloquial voice. And I think those kind of voices are important because I think now more than ever, because of social media and the internet, TikTok and these various websites, we can see so many things at one time. There is no
Mm-hmm.
single story anymore. If you tell a story, people can kind of be like hyperlink it and figure out, well, what does that
Mm-hmm.
really mean? And what have opposing sides said about it? And I want to have that sort of in the story itself.
I think it's really important to point out too that histories are points of view.
Absolutely.
Like we have taken, and I say this as someone who grew up in Massachusetts, so would you like to hear about the Pilgrims in the first Thanksgiving? Because I have some stories. We need a plurality of voices. And, that's what we are. And like, that's who we are, but it's also what we are as a country, right? Like, we are a plurality of people, and there are multiple stories to be told. And some stories were not actually just written down. Like, in some
Yeah.
cases, oral histories are what we had to preserve pieces of culture. I mean, worldwide, there are languages actually that are not written, that are in fact oral, and we need to figure out like how do we capture that knowledge, right?
That's such a wonderful point. I mean, I think that we are very slow to accept the idea that so many histories are hidden,
Mm-hmm.
not by mistake, but on purpose, because the
Yeah,
victors write the history.
right.
And so I think about somebody like the MacArthur Genius Grant winner, Cynthia Hartman, who wrote this essay, Venus Two Acts.
Yep.
And she's a historian who's saying, like, I'm gonna tell you about this girl that was on a slave ship. we only know like her birth date, and we know like she was on the ship, and we know that she was with these people, and yet so much has been elided by history because the guys on the ship don't want you to know that she's a real person with an actual
Hmm.
soul. And so she says, "Well, I'll tell you what. Let's speculate somewhat." And
Hmm.
so for me and the American Daughters, I'm thinking about how like I went to a very radical high school. It was like
Yep.
majority black. My teachers were like activists, and they were like,
Uh-huh.
Harriet Tubman, Harriet Tubman. But even in that situation, I wasn't taught that
Right.
Harriet Tubman was an actual spy for the U.S. military, which is
Right.
now an accepted fact that we sort of all know. And so I'm thinking with the American Daughters, well, what are we not thinking about? And to put it as briefly as possible, I had done some research about 20 years ago where I learned that the Confederates in New Orleans, for some strange reason, didn't really fight when the Union showed up. I'm like, all right, these guys are like total racists, like they're owning slaves. Why are they not fighting? I'm thinking, oh, my great great aunt times eight is one of the enslaved ladies, and how would
Right.
she react in that time period? Well,
Right.
sabotage, and that can
Right.
make them less effective, and that creates this entire story that I created here.
Right. And I grew up being taught history that became the movie Glory. Right.
Yes,
Like with the
right,
Massachusetts Regiment and all of that, I have seen like the giant piece of art on Boston Common and all of that kind of stuff. But the way that story is presented, obviously, is with a really Boston point of view,
right.
which then you go on to consider busing in Boston and some other things. It's like, wow, okay,
It's like, I mean, not to be too political, but it's like when modern day Republicans say, well, we freed the slaves. It's like, well, yeah, but you've changed a lot since then. Or that wasn't the whole story, at that time, how it played out.
but don't you read fiction to build an empathy muscle? I mean, I read so that I can experience stuff that is not necessarily, something I know firsthand, right? Like, again, I someday I will get to New Orleans. I promise you. I will figure this out.
They're waiting for you.
Yeah, but at the same time, like I can be there in a book.
Yeah.
And whether it's you or Ernest J. Gaines or, Britt Bennett, there's so many ways for me to be in the community. And if I can walk in with an open heart, right? Like I have a better chance of understanding what's happened to this place that you call home.
Well, the empathy muscle is a big part of why I love literature and why I write. But at the same time, I can say that. So, for example, I mentioned Robert Jones' The Prophets. And
Yeah,
one of
yeah.
the things he does that is so amazing to me in that book is he makes me feel at least a little bit of sympathy for like the slave owner and the overseer. And these are white characters who are racist, who are holding slaves. I'm like, how do you get so deep into their heads and let me kind of see their point of view, which I found kind of disturbing. That's how talented Robert is. I know he's a friend of mine, right? And in my book, I wasn't really trying that, like for the guy you want to punch in the throat. I'm like, I
Oh,
don't
yeah,
even
yeah.
want to.
Now, sometimes you need a bad guy.
You need a bad guy. In my mind was okay. I really feel that Black women characters in these contexts don't get enough attention, and we don't
Right,
get enough angles as to who they
right,
are. And I'm thinking about, again, like what if my mother and my grandma were in this book? How would they be? And what kind of
right,
love could I show them as a writer to show that they have these different perspectives, these different ways of seeing the world? I mean, the ladies are all on the same side, but they have
right,
different approaches to things. They have, they butt heads over how to approach the
right.
problem at hand.
Well, and also writing is an act of communion, right? Reading is an act of communion. And I think we forget that sometimes because we have this idea that you sit in a corner by yourself scribbling madly, or you sit in a corner by yourself
Mhm.
reading a book and engaging with characters who, may or may not be real. But I do think that that act of communication, and that especially when you have to create a world, right? Like, and you obviously have given us a couple of different extreme points on that, right? We've got the historical
Mhm.
fiction of the American Daughters, and we've got the sort of dystopian of We Cast a Shadow. But this idea that you have to create an entire world
Yeah.
with its own language and its own cadence and its own behaviors.
But two things in that point is that, when you're building a world that doesn't exist, you have to take parts from unusual places. So even the way a lot of the women interact, there's two sources that people would not believe, but I'll just say it because they're not going to believe it. The way that they interact is a lot from me reading X-Men comics as a child. And
Oh,
those,
I get that.
like people like these sort of disparate people who are seen as othered by society, and how do they come together even though they're so different from each other. And then even like Alabama, like in the back of my head, I kept thinking about, all right, how does Dolly Parton sound when she talks to people? It's like make her voice sound realistic in that time period. It's a weird little thing I did. But then the other part of that, you said communion. And I'm thinking about like my women ancestors, like my dad's grandmother, Mama Dilla, who I never met because she died before I was, conscious, basically. And she owned a farm. She owned a slaughterhouse. She was the boss of the entire family, like in 1930, pretty much. And like, how badass is that, to have, but not to know about her until I was a little bit older and kind of go, okay, how can I pay respect to that mentality, that sort of confidence, and that I'm going to take care of my people at all costs, no matter what happens in a world that sees her as like nothing, basically. But she to herself, she's the queen. She's the queen of the family.
Do you think there's another story for Addie somewhere down the line? I kind of feel like you're not done with her, but I might be wrong.
I mean, look, I'm the kind of writer where there's like a little sort of pop-up menu, like in my mind, of like possible future books. Like I have like 10 books that just sitting there I could write. I mean, I can write a version of this book that, or like a sequel that focuses specifically on the activity of the sort of American daughters and like just go into this whole like action adventure, let's get the vial and sneak it out of town and this kind of thing, that kind of stuff. I could follow Audie or her mother into the future, without spoilers, that kind of
Well,
thing.
I was thinking of a very specific sort of time period, which, readers are going to get a little bit of a treat sort of towards the end. And that's the piece I'm sort of specifically thinking about. I'm like, that feels like the start of something else. I would like to meet those people, but that just felt very kind of like, ooh, lots of secrets here. And how did we get here?
I'm gonna give a non-spoiler spoiler for like the future
Okay.
people that like watch this podcast, in like 5 or 10 years. Watch out for that torn out page.
Yeah.
Watch out for there's a painting that's being made in the actual text.
Oh yes.
Look out for that. The Wikipedia entry, like all those little things in my mind are like just sort of off ramps to other books that I could create at some point.
Okay. I'm just happy to know that because I kept thinking this and I was like, well, I shouldn't put words in Maurice's mouth. But...
No, you nailed it. You nailed it. Look, I love to get credit where credit's due. I think a lot of writers are a little afraid. They feel like, if you do it, it diminishes your own work. But I'm the opposite. I'm like, it's all connected to me. And I think with a lot of that ending, I'm thinking about Susan Choi's Trust Exercise. I love that so much. And there's the 3 major parts. And that last part, it like upends everything so much by saying, well, this kind of happened. You're like, wait, what? What?
Yeah. No, I know exactly. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, right? Like we just get to tell stories and we get to feel all of the things.
It is so much more fun than practicing law.
Yeah, I can imagine. I have no complaints about being a bookseller. What can I say? But this was fun. And, before I let you go, is there anything we missed? Seriously, I know I said that a few minutes ago, but you and I we could just do this all the time.
All I will say is thank you to all the booksellers out there. Booksellers and librarians are my favorite people in the world. I volunteered as a high schooler at the library. It was formative in my life. Sometimes people say things like, oh, literature is dying. People are not reading. I think that literature is as strong as it ever was, if not stronger. There are so many great books coming out this year. Not only my book, but just so many books.
There's a lot. There's always a good book.
Just be proud of being somebody who loves literature because this is a great time to be a reader of great literature.
And that's exactly where we're going to end the show because that is a perfect line. Thank you, my friend. We will talk to you soon. American Daughters is out now.
Thanks, Miwa.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.